All right, welcome. We are going to explore Revelation chapter 18 today. But before we get into it, I wanted to do just a couple little side things. Number one, in last week's video, it dealt with an earthquake that splits the land into three parts. And we talked about how that was also probably very symbolic because under Old Testament prophecy in the fall of Solomon's temple, he talked about dividing the nation into three parts. And that was just a way of saying everyone was going to face judgment, but they weren't all going to experience the same type of judgment, and it would fall differently on these three different groups they named. And so he said he was going to split Jerusalem into three different groups. Right before the fall of Solomon's temple, that one would be killed this way, one would be killed that way, and the other would be killed this way. But I also was just curious to see if there was any record of a literal earthquake right before the fall of Herod's temple in AD 70. And sure enough, Josephus says right before Jerusalem fell, like that night before, that there was terrible windstorms, that there was just a terrible, I guess he said it was almost supernatural kind of storm. I mean, not really supernatural, but one so bad that it catches your attention, you know. But then also during the storm was a pretty bad earthquake. He doesn't say any details about what happened from the earthquake. He just said it was a bad earthquake that hit at the same time that this storm was going on. And it brought great dread upon the city because everyone is thinking that is an omen from God, that something bad is about to happen. And sure enough, that was just right before the fall of Jerusalem. So anyway, so that was kind of interesting. And then I stumbled, well, I didn't stumble, but I brought up some things. We had talked a while back, maybe 2 videos ago, about where it talks about turning the sea to blood, and I said there was a time when there were many ships out in the Mediterranean Sea where Jewish people had attempted to get in and flee from the Roman army. Right? You know, remember Jesus said, "Don't go back in and take anything. As soon as you hear this is coming, run." Well, these people probably didn't. They probably packed up and took their time, and on the way out. But Rome caught them down, and so I have a. This is a first-hand account from people that were there, which is kind of cool, right? All the way back 1st century. And so this is it says the Jews could neither escape to land, where all were in arms against them. So he's saying the Romans were on the land. The whole army was on the land, so they couldn't come back to the land. And it says, nor could they sustain a naval battle on equal terms, because their ships weren't really warships. Disaster overtook them, and they were sent to the bottom, boats and all. Some tried to break through, but the Romans could reach them with their lances, and they killed others by leaping upon the barks and passing their swords through their bodies. Sometimes, as the rafts closed in, the Jews were caught in the middle and captured along with their vessels. If any of those who had been plunged into the water came to the surface, they were quickly dispatched with an arrow, or a raft overtook them. If in their extremity they attempted to climb on board the enemy rafts, the Romans cut off their heads or their hands. So these wretches died on every side in countless numbers and in every possible way, until the survivors were routed and driven onto the shore, their vessels surrounded by the enemy. As they threw themselves on them, many were speared while they were still in the water. Many jumped ashore, where they were killed by Romans. And that same person then later goes on to say that that for weeks, even the Romans wouldn't go back because it was such horror and grossness, all the rotten bodies washing up on shore. And so that was a first-hand account of that. All right, so let's get into Revelation 18. So this is the passage that talks about the fall of Babylon the Great, and as we've talked in some of the other ones quite a bit, that you're getting lots of imagery from the Old Testament enemies, right, the big time enemies, Sodom, Egypt, and Babylon, are now being references for Jerusalem, right? And so this fall of Babylon the Great, the reason he calls it a mystery, as we said in the previous chapter, is because it's not really about Babylon, right? He's talking about Jerusalem. And so we're going to pick up with 18, and we're talking about, this is just a continuation. There's, in chapter 18, there's not a ton of talking points, because one whole long stretch of it is very poetic, and it's talking about these people will never be able to do their business, and it lists all these different things that were being sold in Jerusalem, and it's a long section of that. But there are a few things that I would like to point out. So let's start in verse 1. After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. That word there where he says Babylon has become a dwelling place of demons. It's an interesting word that he's using there in the Greek, because in the Septuagint, that is the exact specific word that is used for the dwelling of God in the Holy of Holies, right? So that word that referenced how Jerusalem was so special in the Old Testament, and I say Septuagint because that's the Greek version, and the New Testament was written in Greek. So this Greek word here, that Babylon the Great, which is the great prostitute, which is Jerusalem, has become the dwelling place of demons now. Same word that was used to describe the temple in the Old Testament to show how glorious it was, because it was the dwelling place of the Shekinah glory of God. It was the Holy of Holies was the dwelling place of God. And so what he's saying is God's Spirit is no longer in that temple. He said it has now become the dwelling place of demons, right? And so that's more than just a description of some random city in the future. This is a description of the fall of Jerusalem, and it's kind of adds an interesting element to it, because he's saying this used to be the dwelling place of God. This place used to be renowned because this was the one place in the whole world where God's Spirit dwelled. And then he takes that same word and says, you have now become, right, implying a change, right? You have now become a dwelling place for demons, right? Implying that it was not always that way. The fact that evil is there is a change, right? It has become this. That's another. We know, if you've been following through this, that this is talking about Jerusalem, but sometimes people think Babylon the Great is talking about Rome or many different things, but Rome was never some holy place. It was always demonic. Nebuchadnezzar's place was always evil. Egypt was always evil in general, you know what I mean? But Jerusalem was not. Jerusalem was supposed to be the dwelling place of the Holy Spirit, but now it has become a dwelling place of demons. And then in verse 4, he says, I heard another voice saying, come out of her, my people. And then in verse 3, let me just back up to that one. Jerusalem was one of the most highly traded with cities in the whole world. They had a ton of wealth for the size of the city that they were. Jerusalem was one of the wealthiest cities in the whole world, if not the wealthiest city, other than maybe like, say, the capital of Rome or something. Jerusalem was right up there with the wealthiest cities in the entire world. And so they're doing all kinds of trade, all kinds of exploit. The people are coming in on the Mediterranean Sea and doing all kinds of trading. We're going to see that later, that when Babylon the Great is destroyed, all these people that were trading with Jerusalem, that all grinds to a halt. Herod had such grand building projects. He turned an entire mountain into his home. He redid the entire city of Jerusalem. It was one whole side the Temple Mount area where you go into the temple. And I was reading about that just today, where the guy was saying that it was 70 cubits tall. So this was somebody that lived during that time that was describing the glory of the temple. He said there was one gate that was 70 cubits. So a cubit's a foot and a half. So we're talking 100, 110 feet. That's like an 11-story building. It was that tall. It said it was 25 cubits wide. So that's 40 feet wide was the entryway in. And he said it was wrapped in gold. The whole thing, 10 stories tall, the whole thing wrapped in gold, and the walls down the side of it, he said, were all solid, wrapped in gold. And he said that it made it so bright that when you were coming into from Jerusalem from the outskirts, it was often blinding because so much light was shining off of it. And he said then the rest of the building, they built all the buildings in the rest of the town were all pure white stone. So he said when you came around the hill, Jerusalem almost looked like it had received snow. It was so white and it was gleaming from the light. Adds further impact. You know, Jesus said, you know, you're a city on a hill, that you're not supposed to hide your light. You know, you're supposed to let your light shine, you know, because that's what Jerusalem really was. Their physical light was shining because of all the gold, but their spiritual light was not. So anyways, that is all just to say Jerusalem was a luxurious, very wealthy place. And so when it's saying that she's got lots of trading partners and kings and people all over the place are trading with, that was very true. A lot of commerce ran through Jerusalem. And he says, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. So remember, Jesus told everybody, you know, when you see this coming, you need to leave. So everyone who had put their trust in Jesus was aware of this and began to leave. And so, you know, as the story unfolds, when it got closer to the time, the Holy Spirit gave a prophecy through somebody there in the local church there in Jerusalem and warned all of the Christians ahead of time that they need to leave. And that it was getting close. And so they didn't even have to really wait for Rome to show up. They had a prophetic word from the Holy Spirit. And so so historically we know that all of the Christians left, moved to a city called Pella, and waited out the judgment there. And so as far as we know, all of the Christians left. Now, could somebody have stayed that we just don't know about? Probably. But in general, the entire population of Christians moved out, thousands of them, and repopulated in a city called Pella, so that they were not there during any of this wrath. Right? Her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works in the cup that she has mixed double for her. In the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen and am no widow, and I will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord who judges her. Right? And so, in many ways, this section is just a reiteration of the idea that Jerusalem is fallen, her judgment's coming. The wording there about receiving, she lived luxuriously in verse 7, and sit as a queen and am no widow. If you look in Isaiah chapter 47, much of the wording in verse 8 and 9, he says, and this is talking about the fall of Babylon, right? So again, Jerusalem is being described in the same way that Babylon was described when it fell, because they have become evil. And so he's going back in using the same wording from the Old Testament. Earlier in some of the trumpets and the seals, you see wording from the fall of Solomon's temple. Now that he's describing her as the harlot and as Babylon, you're getting imagery from the fall of Babylon. And so in verse 8, he says, "You who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one beside me, I shall not sit as a widow, nor shall I know the loss of children. But these two things shall come upon you in a moment, in one day." Right? It's almost word for word, the wording of what's going to happen to Babylon the Great. Right? And then Revelation 18:9. If you go back to, if you want to read Ezekiel 26 and 27, this is the fall of Tyre. Right? Tyre was a very wealthy city north of Israel. So there's, in Ezekiel 26 and 27, they were so wealthy and they were doing all this trading and they felt like nothing could ever happen to them. Similar to how Jerusalem is thinking, apparently. And so this next part of chapter 18, starting in verse 9, and when it gives all the way through all this, their items that they're trading and all this list that's about to come, if you go back in and read Ezekiel 26 and 27 about the fall of Tyre, you'll find that is almost word for word in many sections what you find here, describing the fall of Babylon. And so, and again, but that one didn't have anything to do with Babylon. That one was a city called Tyre. Now, so the idea is this isn't really about Babylon. It's about Jerusalem. And so you're getting lots of these images from these prideful, evil cities that fell. We've seen the image of Sodom, we've seen the image of Egypt, we've seen the Babylon, we've seen the image of Tyre. All these major cities of evil, evil capital cities, no less, that are now being used as descriptions for Jerusalem, right? And so, when you read verses 11 all the way through, it's really just a list of the types of things that were being traded by there. And like I said, if you go into Ezekiel 26 and 27, that is the same reference there. All right. Verse 17 says, "And for 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. Every shipmaster and all who travel by ship and sailors and as many as trade on the sea stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what is like this great city?" So even though there are bigger cities in the world, there were very few that were ever as glorious as Jerusalem was, with all of its beautiful white buildings and its golden temple and all this kind of stuff and all the wealth that was there. They've got the beautiful springs of the Gihon and all this kind of stuff that was there. Herod had built this place up to be this glorious place. And so when I was talking about earlier with Herod built this whole mountain into his own palace, and he did all this work there on the temple, all of that building projects and building material, much of that is having to come in from other nations, right? And so there was much trading going on. And then, many wealthy people lived there, and so there's lots of commerce going on. And so, but what I'm after here in 18 is it says they stood off at a great distance and saw the smoke of her burning. This could very well be, it doesn't mention the name of Sodom, but that's exactly how Sodom's destruction was described, that Abraham stood afar off and watched the smoke of her rising as she was burning. And so, it's probably not coincidental that again here in the description of the actual destruction of the city is a reference similar to Sodom's. In verse 20, it says, "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her." I think this is another reason why, among many others that we've given, that this is something in the past, right? There's nobody now or in the future from now that has done anything to the Old Testament prophets that they would need to be avenged on someone now. But Jerusalem, Old Testament Jerusalem, had killed all of those prophets. That's what Jesus said. And he said they were going to be judged for that blood of all the prophets, from righteous Abel to righteous Zechariah that they killed. He said all of those prophets, their blood would be required of Jerusalem. And so God's saying that this city that was destroyed, Babylon the Great, when it finally falls, that, he says, is vengeance for the Old Testament prophets, right? So there's no cities right now. You could destroy any city on the planet right now, and it wouldn't be any kind of vengeance for the Old Testament prophets. And we don't have anything to do with them. But that version of Jerusalem sure did. And it's another reason why you can't equate this to either natural Babylon, or you can't equate this to Rome, which a lot of people try and do. Rome didn't do anything to the Old Testament prophets. Destroying Rome doesn't have anything that would provide vengeance, for what happened to those prophets. There's only one city that's ever mentioned that needs to be destroyed for avenging the blood of the prophets, and Jesus clearly said that was going to be Jerusalem. And so there's no other cities that would fit that description, that now all of these prophets that were killed in Jerusalem. I mean, think about that. Jesus said there's no prophets that aren't killed except outside of Jerusalem, except within Jerusalem. And I don't know if he's just hyperbole, or if literally there weren't any ever killed outside of that. I don't know. But Jesus said, I think he was being somewhat sarcastic a little bit, saying, almost heaven forbid somebody die a prophet outside of Jerusalem, as a way of saying that they killed so many of them. And so if all of these prophets, to where Jesus would say, how could a prophet die outside of Jerusalem? They all die here. If that's the type of wording that he's used, then how could any other city be the city that has to be destroyed to avenge what happened to them? You know what I mean? Destroying Rome, destroying Babylon, the actual Babylon, destroying some future city something in our future, none of that would avenge what happened to those people in Jerusalem. The only thing that's going to avenge what happened to them in Old Testament Jerusalem is the destruction of Old Testament Jerusalem. Right? And then verse 21 says, the millstone around the neck here. Jesus talked about that. He said, if you offend one of these little ones, it'd be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck and thrown into the sea. Well, all of that comes from Jeremiah 51, verses 61 through 64. And in that, it's kind of a prophetic thing, and he tells this guy to go take a millstone and tie it and throw it in the Euphrates River as a prophetic demonstration. If you wanted to look that up, it was Jeremiah 51, verses 61 through 64. Sariah is told to go take this millstone, tie it, throw it into the Euphrates, and say, in the same way that millstone was thrown into the river, that's how violent Babylon's going to be thrown down. Right? So when Jesus comes and says, it would be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck and thrown into the sea than to offend one of these little ones that are coming after me, he's talking about the fall of Babylon. It's going to be easier on Babylon, their destruction, than what's going to happen to somebody that tries to take a little one away from Jesus. But then now, in describing the fall of Jerusalem, he circles back around to that imagery of the millstone and says the destruction of Jerusalem will also be like the millstone thrown into the sea. The idea of that is, you throw a millstone, a big old heavy rock. They're real big. You can't only pick one up. You probably need a couple people, and you throw it in to the sea. It's going to make a big splash, and it's going to immediately sink. And the imagery is, that's how quick and fantastic is going to be the fall of this city. And so we know historically Babylon fell very quickly. And we know historically Jerusalem fell very quickly. And so that's the imagery that he's using there. And then, they're talking about how they're saying, woe is, everyone, because this great city has fallen. I want to read, before we close out this video, just one more kind of first-hand account. When I came upon this, I had never heard this. It was actually a kind of a unique story from within Jerusalem while they were under siege. And so So this is told by people who were there. And he says, a portent, still more alarming, so a warning, still more alarming, had appeared 4 years before the war, at a time when profound peace and prosperity still prevailed in the city, right? So this is a story of just, right before the war, a couple years before the war starts. One Jesus, the son of Ananias. So this is not anything to do with our Jesus. He was an uncouth peasant, and he came to the feast at which every Jew is expected to put up a tabernacle for God. So that's the Feast of Tabernacles. And he stood in the temple courts. He suddenly began to cry out, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the sanctuary, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against the whole people." Day and night he uttered this cry as he went about walking up and down the streets. Some of the leading citizens were seriously annoyed at these ominous pronouncements, laid hold of the man and beat him savagely. But he, without uttering a word in his own defense or for the private information of those who were beating him, persisted in uttering these same warnings as before. Thereupon the magistrates, rightly concluding that some supernatural impulse was responsible for his behavior, took him before the Roman governor. And there, although flayed to the bone with scourges, he neither begged for mercy nor shed a tear, but raising his voice to an almost mournful cry, he answered every stroke with, "Woe, woe, woe to Jerusalem." When Albinus the governor asked him who he was and whence he came and why he uttered these cries, he made no reply whatsoever, but endlessly repeated his dirge over the city until Albinus released him, because he judged him to be insane. And throughout this time, until the war broke out, he never approached another citizen, nor was seen talking to anyone, but daily, like a prayer that he had memorized, he recited his lament, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." He never cursed any of those who beat him from day to day, nor did he thank those who gave him food. His only response to anyone was that same melancholy prediction. His voice was heard most of all at the festivals, so for 7 years and 5 months he continued his wail. His voice was as strong as ever and his vigor unabated, till during the siege, after seeing the fulfillment of his foreboding warnings, he was silenced. He was going his rounds, shouting in penetrating tones from the wall, "Woe, woe, once more to this city and the people and this temple." And then he added a last word, "And woe unto me also." And a stone hurled from the ballista struck him, killing him right there on the spot. Thus, with those same forebodings still on his lips, he met his end. So it's just kind of interesting because in an earlier chapter, the angel is crying out, "Woe, woe, woe to Babylon and the inhabitants of the earth," and all this kind of stuff. And it's very interesting that would have been the same overlapping time that there's a man walking up and down the streets of Jerusalem saying, "Woe to Jerusalem, woe to Jerusalem." So anyways, that doesn't necessarily help you have any groundbreaking revelations from end time stuff, but it is kind of a neat picture of something that probably not too many people know that happened, unless you kind of dig into some of that stuff and read some of these stories about what was going on in the city. So anyways, all right, we'll end there. And then when we get into 19, we got just a little bit more about the fall of Babylon. And then we get into a really neat part where we see Jesus on a war horse, right? So we'll talk about that in our next video.